Today we've got John Mitchell from Stanford University, Andrew Conway from Princeton University, David Randall from the American Museum of Natural History, Ira Gooding from Johns Hopkins University, and Carlton Karan from Melbourne University here with us. And I'll let them take it from here. Oh, sorry, one more point. We've got an extra hashtag on Twitter for you to submit questions. This is #assess, #Coursera14. So if you have Twitter and you have questions or thoughts from the panel, please use these hashtags to shoot them over. Thanks.
Yeah, if you can't tweet, you're in the wrong room. Just kidding. All right, so we have a great panel assembled here. I had nothing to do with assembling the panel, by the way. It's all orchestrated by our friends at Coursera, so hopefully you will owe them thanks at the end. We are going to start with a brief statement from each of the panelists about assessment in the order in which we are seated across the table. Then we'll have a short discussion among us on a couple of different questions, just briefly, to kind of get a few discussion points out. And then at the end of the panelist discussion, we decided to have a short period in which you can each meet the people sitting next to you, and in groups of 3 to 5, decide on a question that one of you can tweet using the hashtags on the board, and then we'll have a discussion based on questions which will be driven by those questions you contribute, unless you're not active enough, in which case we'll have to pass the microphone around. That also gives you some form of recourse if you feel remorse about the question you entered before, or you think of something new during the discussion and so on. So that's the plan, a little bit of technology, a little bit of in-person discussion. Hopefully we will all learn something. And so without further ado, let's start with Andrew Conway.
Okay, so I teach a MOOC on Coursera called Statistics 1, which is designed to be a very basic, very friendly introduction to statistics. So I think it's very fitting that I'm leading off this session on assessment, because I know that as MOOCs are developing rapidly in the last 2 years, we've all become really excited about sort of interactive assessments. Formative assessments is the technical term. That is, assessments that go beyond evaluation and enhance learning. And in fact, that's one of the things that hooked me in when I first met with Daphne before this all launched 2 years ago. She cited some work by Karpicki and Roediger in cognitive psychology on what's called the retrieval practice effect. So I teach statistics, but I'm also a cognitive psychologist, and I know Jeff Karpicki and Roddy Roediger. So I was impressed that this computer scientist had looked to the cognitive psychology literature to think about how to form more enhanced assessments. And I think that's probably where this conversation will go. But I just want to remind us all that we need to stay with the basics of assessment. So regardless of whether you're doing assessments online or old-fashioned paper and pencil, what I want to start with is just reminding us all that there are fundamental concepts that we need to embrace as we think about assessments. And as I said, I teach statistics, but I'm also a psychologist, so I'm familiar with this subdiscipline within psychology called psychometrics, which has been around for 100 years. This is where intelligence testing comes from. And there are a lot of ideas and principles and statistical models that we can use and draw from as we think about assessments. And these are just the basic properties. Before we get to anything fancy, just assessing whether we have things like reliability, validity. We could apply factor analysis to our data to see what kind of structure of abilities or skills we're assessing in our classes. And these data sets are to die for. So I do this type of work. I've been doing this type of work for 20 years, and I've never had data like this. So I've never had students like this, 100,000, and I've never had sample sizes like this. So I know everybody has their one thing that they'd like to see Coursera invest more in, and I think mine would be a psychometrics division. I mean, we have more data now than agencies like the ETS or the College Board, and they have way more psychometricians, and there's a lot we could do just with the basic data. Beyond that, and I think that's where we're going to go probably more in the discussion, I call assessments plus. Those are formative assessments. So just beyond basic assessment, can we put things into our MOOCs that, that gauge learning but also enhance learning? And again, we can look to the cognitive psychology literature for things like retrieval practice effects, the test-retest effect, the generation effect. Also some really interesting work, if you're not familiar with it, by Carol Dweck at Stanford on mindset. And we're actually implementing that into my course, where we give different types of feedback after students get questions wrong. And you can sort of manipulate the feedback as to whether it's sort of more, suggests a more malleable ability underlying performance of the assessment, or a more fixed ability. And particularly in statistics and math courses, that's an important thing to address. So I think that's all I have. I just wanted to start off by reminding us that we have some good theory and statistical models and psychometrics that we can draw from, and that we got to start there and not forget the basics. And now I'll turn it over to the fancier assessments.
David Randall, why don't you take the podium and introduce yourself?
Okay. So I'm David Randall. I'm from the American Museum of Natural History, and I don't know if what I'm going to talk about is fancy. I want to share with you some sort of our practical experience. So we're a member of the Teacher Professional Development strand at Coursera, and which one, the spacebar? Yeah. And so just to remind you, we're famous for our big dinosaurs, and Dum Dum, if you've seen the movie A Night at the Museum. But we also, and what's not really, really well known, is that we have over 200 working scientists behind the scenes here working on paleontology and evolution and you know, microbiology and earth sciences. And so we've tapped into this to create a suite of online courses that we've been offering for a little over a decade now. And these are highly facilitated courses for science teachers. So we offer them for graduate credit through partner institutions. And they're co-taught by a working scientist and a teacher, somebody who has a classroom experience. And so they're highly facilitated. All of the interaction here happens through, mostly through discussion forums and assignments. So it's text-based, asynchronous. And so we've tried to leverage this in our MOOC effort. And we've put together 3 MOOCs. I was the co-instructor on 2 of them, so 2 in the life sciences and 1 in the earth sciences. And we're trying to look at ways that we could use our assessments to generate some interaction between the participants, and to check to make sure that they'd of course done the work and learned what we were trying to get them to learn. So we went to the traditional multiple choice questions. Our courses are 4 weeks long, so we had a question, a set of 10 questions at the end of each week. And then each course had 1 peer-graded assignment that sort of stretched from the second week, where they would do it and turn it in. The third week was the grading period, and then the 4th week they would get feedback. And so really the multiple choice questions were sort of to check to see if they kind of accomplished what we needed to do. We have essays in our courses, and so they checked that. And then the peer-graded assignments, we were trying to go for more of an application of the course content. So we try to make that a real learning experience in addition to an assessment. And in order to pass our course and get a certificate, this peer-graded assignment was required. So you do your assignment, you grade 3 other people's assignments. And we knew that that would be kind of raising the bar and probably lower the number of people who receive certificates in our courses. But we thought that was really important that people applied the things in the course. So briefly, the multiple choice questions were address the content from the videos. People can take them as many times as they wanted. offering our courses again. We're now in our second offering. The genetics course just finished last week, and we've been revising the questions, the multiple choice questions, between offerings when we see items that seem to be particularly difficult for people. Sometimes it was our fault, for wording them badly, and other times they were just hard questions, and those we left, and the questions were unclear. We tried to make them more clear, and I think we succeeded in most of the cases. The couple of our takeaways is these are really hard to make. So to make really good multiple choice questions, you sort of have to anticipate the misconceptions that people might have, and then try to create your distractors so that you're getting at those. It requires a lot of work, a lot of research. We hired one of our experienced seminars on science teachers who spent years in the classroom. She had a really hard time doing it, and I kind of realized that she never gave multiple choice tests during her career as a high school teacher. But they are really easy to grade. And then for each of our courses, we had a different peer-graded assessment. The genetics course and the evolution course had essay-based questions. So there we asked people to put together a 600-word essay and then grade. The genetics course was based on a framework for ethical thinking that we introduced early in the course. The evolution course was based on some work that's being done. If you're from the States, you're probably familiar with the next generation science standards. So the question is really one of the performance expectations that came from the new standards. The one that worked really well for us was our assessment with the Earth course. And I mentioned before we wanted to really make these authentic learning experience. But we've also found through our other online work that and there's a lot of research into online learning that interaction between the community, online learning is a great place for reflectivity, so people don't have to shoot from the hip. They can think and really post thoughtful responses. And we wanted that to carry over, and we've been struggling with how to do that in a MOOC where you have a lot of people in a course and you can't do a lot of facilitation. So we came up with this, we adapted from our other Earth course, the 6-week completely online version, this local geology assignment. So we had people go out. We modeled it. This is Dr. Ro Kinsler, who was the co-instructor for this course, and we actually went out into Central Park, and she looked at the local geology there and modeled the assignment for everybody. And so basically it's to go out, make some observations about your local geology, do some research to figure that out, to figure out where your rocks came from and kind of what's the geologic history that you can infer based on those rocks. And we had people post in the forum some pictures and a brief description, and then the explanation was as a peer-graded assignment. So, but the first thing that they put in their assignment was a link to their discussion post. And part of our rubric was to read the discussion post, look at the pictures, look at the description, and people were scored on that. And so we found that it really generated a lot of great interaction within the course, and it was a really good learning experience for everybody. This is some local geology from Australia. And some of the discussion, somebody got in and clarified, made some example. This talked about the gullying in the poorly cemented sandstone. So somebody with a little bit of geologic background came in and helped out and helped the group clarify what was going on in the geology here. So the key to using this, we found, was to develop really clear, simple rubrics, because the people who are doing the grading aren't experts. So we tried to make, these are like 2 of the items of, I think there were 4 or 5 in the rubric for the evolution course. And more or less, we got pretty good feedback about it. There were a few complaints. We had people recommending that we offer, that in order to be a peer grader, you had to take a test beforehand. And we sort of rejected that because it was antithetical to the whole spirit of the course. But for the most part, when people have complained about their grade and we've had the capacity to look at it, the peer grading was pretty accurate. And I think a lot of the research is starting to show that that's true. So that's it. I'll leave everything else for the questions.
Great, thank you.
Okay, like one of the presenters from the panel earlier today, I've given up slides for Lent. So you just have to listen to me and not look at anything.
But you
Nothing,
haven't
nothing.
given up your name.
Oh, I'm Ira Gooding from Johns Hopkins University. And at the School of Public Health, we have been doing online education for about 15 or 16 years, 4-credit online education. And we have about 120 courses online. And for about 8 years or so, we've been doing open courseware. So we came to the idea of MOOCs as a logical next step, and with a fair amount of experience with certain elements that would come in handy for putting together MOOCs. But one thing that we didn't really have much experience with was designing assessments for large populations. The largest of our online courses is probably only about 250 students or so, and you can handle that with TAs. So we didn't really have to think about all of these large-scale assessment questions before this point. So, and then OCW, OpenCourseWare, those of you who are familiar with it, doesn't really have assessments at all, other than as open educational materials that people can use and adapt and use for independent learning, but don't have to be graded within OpenCourseWare. So this was really a new area for us, and I was instantly intrigued by the idea of using peer assessment for grading essays and projects, and so our first couple courses that featured peer assessment, by the way, we've got, I think we've run about 15 MOOCs from the School of Public Health so far, and we've got about 9 or 10 more in the pipeline. So our first couple that we did back in the fall of 2012 included some really bad peer assessments. One big mistake that we made early on was that there was one final essay that was peer assessed and it was worth 80% of your grade, which was, the stakes were just way too high to make it effective, and so that was a big mistake. Another big mistake was having a mixture of objective questions objective knowledge that we were trying to assess, mixed in with some of the other elements that lend themselves better to peer assessment. So we found that it's best to keep the objective stuff in the multiple choice quizzes and that sort of thing, and let peer assessment really be focused on what it does best. But some of the lessons learned from the past 2 years of doing these peer assessments, and I think we've gotten better at them as we've gone along. And part of that is that we've learned that the students take this responsibility of grading one another incredibly seriously. One of my favorite things to do is I monitor the discussion forums for most of our courses, and help guide students in terms of helping them better understand what the expectations are, the logistics of the course, and there are always a ton of questions about the grading rubric, and students want to do things like, well, could we give half a point because they almost got this right but not quite, and they're looking for more and more granularity because they want to get that assessment just right, and so they take it very, very seriously, which is wonderful. But I think when we're designing our assessments, we need to take that into account, that what might not seem like a big difference to us, a half a point here, a point there, is taken very, very seriously by many of the people who we have essentially outsourced assessment to. Also, many students have never done anything like this before. Both phases, both the submission phase and the evaluation phase. Some students have never done anything like this before, so we need to remember when developing our assessments that we plan for this being a very, very first experience, maybe with writing an essay in an academic setting and with grading in an academic setting. And so we need to make sure that not only do we make our instructions very, very clear, but that we also give them some practice. And that's why it's my policy now, and I strongly encourage all the instructors I work with to do this, that if you're going to have a peer assessment, you should probably have 2 peer assessments. The first one, pretty low stakes, pretty basic, but it allows them to learn the process. Because if you haven't done it before, the process can be a little tricky, and you want to take that anxiety out of it. So give them one assignment that's relatively small scale, relatively low stakes in terms of their final grade, and let them cycle through that, and so that when you give the higher stakes second assessment, they're prepared, that you've stripped away some of that anxiety about the process so they can really focus on the assignment and the grading. And the other thing that I've learned is that in the process of giving a sequence of peer assessments, it's great if they can all build on one another and also build on the other learning activities that have happened in the course. So these are important elements that I try to build in when I can, and sometimes we'll use the discussion forum as a practice session, have them talk about the things that they're going to write about so that by the time they get to writing about it, they've already had a little bit of that practice. Also, if you can create projects where students build on something as they go along. In one course that we had, which was about training community health workers, we had students along the way build a training plan for a group of community health workers. So we asked them to use a real-world setting that they've experienced, and if they didn't have one, then we gave them one. A training plan has lots of different elements: objectives, sub-objectives, methods, resources, and evaluation tools. And so the first peer assessment, they had to do parts A and B, and they got feedback and a grade on that. Well, the second phase of the assessment, they had to resubmit parts A and B plus parts C and D, get feedback and a grade on that. So by the time they got to the third assessment, they're submitting an entire training plan that they've already gotten feedback on the first 2 phases, so they've got a nice complete project and product at the end for the final peer assessment, and each one of the stakes get higher each phase. So we tried to combine all of those elements together so that the students could really have a full package and get used to the process and have it integrated into the rest of the course and not just a standalone thing that's done at the end. So those are a few lessons that I've learned along the way, and I think the thing that the number one thing that I've learned is that the entire process of the peer evaluation is the learning process. It's not just writing the assignment, but the act of evaluating one's peers in and of itself is almost as important, if not more important, for learning outcomes as doing the essay in the first place, because students get a chance to see what their peers are doing, and they have a chance to think about it critically and then supply feedback. So those are all really important elements, and we can save the rest for the discussion here. So thanks.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. I'm Carlton Karan, and I play the role as kind of a teaching assistant at, yeah, that's not the first slide. Can you do me a favor and try to get
surprise here?
That's all right. So at Melbourne University, I play the role of teaching assistant, and I'm very integral in the development of novel assessments, and my day job is as a researcher at this NICTA lab in Australia. And the class I'm going to tell you about today is discrete optimization. But first, let me start with a question. Have you ever thought of a new kind of online learning activity, or has one of your instructors thought of a new kind of online learning activity? These kind of things are really exciting to me, and the Coursera platform actually gives you 2 really great ways to integrate these into your courses. The first one is programming assignments and external graders, and the second one is this really new released standard called Learning Tools Interoperability. So these really open up the platform for you to integrate all sorts of new and exciting things. And what I'm going to tell you about in this talk is one such example of that in this discrete optimization course. So adding one of these new assessment types is a ton of work, but I really think it's worth it. And the reason is pedagogy. We have a very strong philosophy in discrete optimization that pedagogy, the way that the students learn, has to do with just doing activities and really trying to explore a different area. So we have this idea that discovery-based learning is really essential for students to learn the craft of discrete optimization. So that we're all on the same page, let me give you an example. Imagine you want to teach a lesson on mass, volume, and density to your students. You could just give them the formula and a bunch of exercises like short answer questions or fill in the blanks and just see if they can execute the formula and call that done. But a discovery-based approach would be to give them a tank of water like this, and then give them 2 different Coke cans, a Diet Coke and a regular Coke, and ask them to put them in the water and see what happens. What they'll observe is that one of these cans floats and one of them sinks. Now you could ask the students, why is that? We know that they actually have the same volume, but how could one sink and one float? And you can imagine how this would lead to a rich discussion that actually might lead them to discover mass, volume, and density all in their like within the class discussion. So in discrete optimization, how do we integrate this idea? What we try to do is emulate what happens in the real world, which is you have a boss who says, we have to solve this problem, and you cannot fail. And essentially what we do inside of the Coursera platform is we build a playground where the students can explore different ideas for solving the problem, and they just get feedback about how well they've done at that task. So let me tell you just a little bit about how these assignments work so that we can you understand where I'm coming from with this kind of thing. So I'm going to show you on the left the instructor view of preparing one of these assignments, and then how the student sees it. First off, the instructor needs to define the problem at hand the student needs to solve. And we have to formalize this in terms of some mathematics and some input data. But the details aren't really important. The course covers how to understand that. But so we specify this. We hand it off to the student. We say, here's the problem. Figure out how to solve the problem. What they go is they leave and they do some work. It could be implementing an algorithm. It could be just working on a piece of paper. But the ultimate thing they come to is a solution to this problem. And we define an API like this text block down here with this 8 and this 1 and these zeros for them to communicate back to us what their solution is. So they pass this back to us, and we know how to inspect this. So we can look at the 8 right here and say, okay, this is a good or a bad solution. So we generate some feedback. Let me show you what that feedback, and then we pass that feedback back to the student. So let me show you what it looks like. If a student submitted this 8 solution, what they're going to see inside the Coursera platform is you get 3 out of 10 points. That's really good, that's a good start, but if you want to get more points towards your grade, you have to improve your solution to 1 of 18. So we envision the student goes and they do more work and they think really hard, and then they come up with this solution that has 18, and they submit it to the platform. Now they get 7 out of 10 on their grade, and it says, okay, good job, 18. If you want to get a better grade, you have to get it up to 19 points. So they work really hard, they come up with a 19 solution, and they get this one, and now finally they get 10 out of 10, and we say, awesome job, keep going, you're just doing a great job on this assignment. And this shows you a trace of what it looks like for a student inside of the platform. So on day 1, this student submitted 1 time and got 3 out of 10. On the second day, they submitted 5 times, all with 7 out of 10 as they slowly improved their solution. And on the third day, they got 10 out of 10, and this is the last entry, so they stopped working at this point. Now, why would we go to all this effort to build this new kind of assignment and do this whole discovery-based thing? There's already some basic stuff in the platform. And for me, it all comes down to this question that we asked in a mid-course survey. So far, what is your favorite part of the course? Now we just asked all the students an opt-in survey what they thought, and this was a free text question, so we had no simple way of analyzing it. What I'm going to show you is a word cloud with the most common words being bigger. And so this is what came out of this survey. And what you can see here is that the lectures were pretty popular, but these programming assignments were the most popular thing in the course. And just think about that. It's like you talk to your student, they say, I really like going to the class, I really like the lectures, but I can't wait to go home and do the homework. And to me, that's like, this discovery learning is really tapping into something about exploration, about, an active process that's really getting the students engaged. So this is what we did in discrete optimization, and I really want to see every course on Coursera have their own custom assessment. So I call that LTI for everyone. So please, think about this. Make your own assessments. Thank you.
Great. So thanks to all of the panelists for going over by about 50%. That's pretty good, actually, on the overall scheme of things. Usually panels go on and on and on, and nobody gets a chance to ask questions. We had thought originally of now a kind of a discussion among the panelists, but I think we've kind of used that time up in going over a little bit. So what I think I'd like to do instead is reserve about 10 minutes at the end for each of the panelists to make a kind of concluding comment, and rather than discuss now what we might want in the future, let's do that at the end so that we get the group participation phase underway now. So let's try this. What the heck? Why not? It could be fun. Why don't you stand up if you need to, converse with a group of 3 to 5 people around you, and see if you can formulate one question that you'd like to ask the panel, or more questions, and then tweet it. And we'll allow 3.5 minutes, and I'll be really strict about that if I can, okay? See if you have fun with that, and then we'll handle questions from Twitter.
Okay, so first question from Twitter. This would have been covered in the moderated section. What type of assessment would you like to add to the platform? What's missing?
All right, somebody want to take a stab at that? With LTI, you can add anything. Is that your?
Yeah, well, so.
Why don't you tell us about what LTI works for?
So my philosophy on this is that the Coursera platform itself needs to handle assessments which are very broadly applicable, and then different subject areas should be designing their own ones that aren't part of the core platform. So I actually think peer assessment plus multiple choice, the multiple choice quiz is quite flexible, especially when you do JavaScript injection. So I think we have a pretty good core things. It's about what more could we, special things that could be added for specific subject areas, like in physics, maybe simulation, interactive simulations could be really great. I can imagine a lot of assessments that involve more imagery, pictures, comparing pictures, analyzing pictures.
Maybe can you say a little bit about what sort of expertise and what sort of time investment is needed to add something that sounds relatively simple, just so people get calibrated, because I think that's an important issue.
Okay, so if you want to add an assessment using the API there, you really need a professional software engineer. But one is enough. I did all of the assessments in discrete optimization, I would say. I mean, they need to be good, but one is enough for a simple assessment, not a very complicated one. But I think for the amount of money we're investing in production, video production and other types of things, this one engineer is actually not a huge investment. It's just about allocating the funds for it. But it's very possible.
Anybody else want to take an answer to that question?
I would just add that for peer assessment, I would like to see an enhancement where a student could submit a draft and get the peer assessment evaluations done, and then just revise that draft right in the interface, so that there could be a submission evaluation back and forth several times with several rounds of peer assessment without having to do what I described in the project-based peer assessment, which was basically have 3 whole rounds, which were each 2-week cycles. 1 week for submission, 1 week for evaluation. So it's 6 weeks worth of process that could potentially be condensed if you could just have those rounds all built in to one big peer assessment.
As I mentioned, I'd like to see Coursera invest more in assessing the assessments. So not necessarily adding more features, but investing resources at home at Coursera so they can do things like item analysis to see which items are discriminating students from one another, to see which videos are capturing people's attention and which ones aren't. Because those analyses are so similar across all the different courses, yet they take a lot of time to do. So by the time you're done with a MOOC, the last thing you want to do is struggle through that massive data set to do this item analysis to come up with better multiple choice tests. But it's a gold mine of data, but it requires a lot of time. So I think a new psychometrics division at Coursera.
David, do you have a quick answer, or do you want to move on to the next question?
I'd like to see a better way to use the discussions as a form of assessment. Right now, you can call up a person and see what they've done, but all you get is a number of posts, and so there's no real way to look at the quality of the post and the depth of the post, because I think that's a real. provide our content and we direct the students through a progression of, the topic as we envision it. But, one of the things that we find in our online discussions is that a lot of times the best discussions are stuff that the students bring up. And, there's people with a lot of expertise taking Coursera courses. And so, the answers can be provided by the community, or the TA or one of the authoring scientists. But if the discussions could become a more authentic piece of the assessment, I think that would really enhance what can be done with the courses.
All right, that was a great long question. Nikhil, let's have another question from Twitter.
Yeah, we've got a few good questions here.
Yeah,
so
moving us along a little bit, I think.
Sure. The next question is there a qualitative value to peer assessments? I.e., is there more to this than just dealing with MOOC scale?
You want to go ahead?
I'll just say, as the person who did the automated grading one, I think there is definitely. The process, as Ira was mentioning, of evaluating your peers is another type of learning that's really valuable.
Yeah, I agree that the students self-report that they're learning an awful lot from grading their peers, particularly in that first assessment when they realize that, oh, I'm really on the wrong track. And now they've read 4 of their classmates' assessments, and they've learned from that, and they can then apply what they've learned in that next round. It really makes a big difference.
In our earth science course, we got some comments that some of the people after doing the peer grading felt like they had a tour of the geology of the world. So I think there's a lot to be said for the assignment, the assessment being a tool for teaching.
So I'm going to step out of my role as moderator for the moment and channel Scott Clemmer from Stanford, who has a really great course. I'll just tell you what I liked about it. This is a human-computer interaction course with a lot of design elements. What he found historically was he was poorly ranked, extremely highly ranked as an instructor, but poorly ranked on fairness in grading. And the reason was that engineers and computer scientists thought that grading of design projects was totally arbitrary, and they didn't understand why they weren't all getting A+. So then he decided about 7 years ago that he ought to focus on teaching evaluation of design so that the students in his class would understand why they were not all getting A's. And this tied in extremely well with his scaled MOOC activity, in which the peer evaluation then became a topic of the course and one of the most valuable things about it. Other comments?
Just a quick comment. I, of course, being the stats guy, I would make it a quantitative question and just see, does it enhance learning? Does it enhance retention? It could be an empirical question.
All right. Our Twitter monitor is sitting down.
These keep coming in, so I'm trying to decide here. So what are some good strategies for evaluating the quality of student peer assessments or peer evaluations?
How do you know whether peer? Somebody mentioned the peer evaluations were actually pretty good. Maybe that's a useful starting point.
Well, we looked at a few of them, and we responded to complaints, especially if people were taking the course for the signature track. And we found that we had to change grades in a couple cases, but for the most part, they were pretty good. And I think there's some research in the panel before this one, actually. Some research was cited that that their assessments were within a grade or a grade and a half, or half a grade, or a grade of being fairly accurate when they actually had the instructor do a lot of evaluation of some of the assignments that were peer assessed, and they found that they were pretty close. So I think, as we gather data on this, and I think it all comes down to the rubric. You write a good rubric, and you're going to get good peer assessments.
I would say that one thing that's frequently missing from the evaluations, in that it's really hard for students to do this, I know that I'm not particularly good at it, is writing good qualitative feedback to the person who wrote the essay that you're evaluating. Using the rubric is one thing, but then at the end where you have to talk about strengths and weaknesses and areas for improvement, where you actually have to write something original that's going to be useful, that's really hard to get out of the students. Some people provide it, but it's hard to require it, and so that's definitely an area where I think that the feedback is lacking. And when we've surveyed students, that's the one thing that they found least useful about the peer assessment process was that sort of open-ended qualitative feedback that they were hoping to get was just not good enough.
All right, next, pick one at random.
Okay, assessments tend to be pretty simplistic. Are there ways to make them more robust, especially given the number of students?
I would just like to say that the discrete optimization assessments, I would say, are anything but simplistic. They're incredibly challenging, and I think that's because we had a specific idea in mind and we implemented it.
So would you be comfortable giving the same kind of credit for that course as you would for a hand-graded college course?
Yeah, absolutely. That was our goal when we set out, was to try to replicate. The course was developed at Brown University before it went to Melbourne. The in-class experience as much as possible. And so we set a high bar and we stuck to it.
You want to try that question? How would you feel your MOOC assessment compares with what you would provide to students on campus?
In my case, it's pretty similar. And what I was going to say is I think that varies tremendously across disciplines and different types of courses. So I think like in computer science and statistics, we can actually give pretty complex and difficult assignments. They don't have to submit all of that work, but then we have, in my course, they have to write software, computer code to run statistical analyses, and then they have to answer questions that where they have to interpret the output of that analysis. So in order to answer the questions, they have to write a pretty sophisticated computer program. We're not looking at their code because that would be more difficult. But to get to the endpoint, they have to do a pretty complex project.
Any other comments?
I would just say that I would not at this stage because, as David mentioned earlier, the ability to incorporate discussion forum participation into the grade is something that needs to get better. I mean, that's usually a big element of grading in a face-to-face university level class is level of participation, and we just don't yet have a good way of capturing that.
All right, more of a philosophical question. Should peer assessment be anonymous or not?
Everyone has a strong opinion about that.
Well, I'm not a philosopher, but I would say it should be anonymous. I think that makes people, gives them the freedom to maybe say things that they wouldn't say otherwise. I mean, being in a MOOC is fairly anonymous anyway because you're in a group with thousands of other people, but my vote would be for anonymous.
I agree, but then I have a question back to you. If one of the elements in your assignment is linking to the discussion post, you can't keep it anonymous, right? Unless they're using an alias, but most people don't use an alias in. Well, you can post anonymously, but you wouldn't necessarily.
Do you mean the grader should be anonymous or the submitter? I mean,
well, that's a good point. Yeah. Right. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, I understand.
I think the grader should be anonymous. I think, I would love to see, I think that, my big point here is that I would love to see lots of, authentic interaction and discussions and have, a community of learners developing these courses a little more than at least our experience is. So, that can't be anonymous, but.
Fair enough. Thank you.
So what mechanism would you recommend for pairing evaluation samples with rubrics?
Can you say that again?
Yep. What mechanism would you recommend for pairing evaluation samples with rubrics? I think this is more of a future-oriented question. If you could change grouping within peer assessments, what would you do? Do you think randomization is the right approach, or would you look for more intentional grouping of peer assessments? That's my interpretation of the question.
After this question, we'll take one from the floor that by microphone. We're stumped.
Well, I hate to come back to the same answer, but I think it's going to depend on the discipline, right? So in the humanities, it's going to be very different from something like computer science or statistics, where, and I don't do peer assessment, and I don't work in the humanities, so, so I'll stop there. But I imagine that in those situations, I know at Princeton, the first MOOC out of Princeton was from the sociology department, just an intro to sociology class, which was fascinating on a global level. And in that case, I could imagine, doing some sort of, separating out subsamples for peer assessment. But again, it's not.
What's our mechanism? Does somebody have a microphone that can walk around? I think we had some.
All right, I'll walk around.
My hope was to give you a chance to look at all the Twitter feed while somebody else did the. You can do it? Okay.
Well, I'll give it to the first person, and you can take it from there.
All right. Somebody feel like the Twitter feed did not represent your view sufficiently, and you'd like to pitch in real time. Sorry.
Sorry. Actually, did tweet my question, but since there are many people on Twitter, thank you for the microphone. Some problem we encountered in Leiden University is that with a large number of native English speakers, peer reviewing other non-native speakers of English and judging them on their language rather than their content. So how do you propose to prevent that, or to at least address it before the course starts?
Teach statistics.
We explicitly tell them not to do that, not to grade them on their English. That's not what the course is about. People need to be able to communicate their ideas, but we talk about things like logic, making a logical argument, using evidence, using examples, but then explicitly saying don't judge them on their grammar. Although being able to write well is important, being able to write well in English is not necessarily a skill that everybody needs to have. But we do say that all submissions have to be done in English, and maybe that would be a way of, I could see, matching submissions with evaluators would be if we could do that by language. We could have people write in their own primary language.
Thank you. I'm Chandrika Bahadur from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. My question goes back to judging the quality of evaluations, and I'm wondering, have any of you, or have any of the courses that you're familiar with, tried to reward students for the quality of their evaluation as judged by the recipient? So if I evaluate her assignment, and she's expected to give feedback to me, basically describing how useful that evaluation was for her, then I get a higher grade. So you get graded two ways: one, on the actual assignment that you've done, and second, on how useful your peer evaluation has been for the other student. Has anybody done that, or has anyone thought of doing that? And does that capture some of these issues around the quality of the evaluation?
I think it's a great enhancement, but as far as I know, it's not available to us in the platform right now. But I think it's a great idea.
I know of a computer science course in Canada that wasn't a MOOC, but it was doing exactly that, and they found it to be very effective. But I think it is a limitation of the platform right now.
Great. So we have somebody with a microphone. I have to yield to the man with a microphone. And then the next question after that, could we have one or two that are about automated assessment, just to kind of balance things out? But go with whatever you have.
Okay, thanks. Tom Evans, Ohio State. And to follow up on what you had just said, that was an issue that we encountered within Coursera's peer review system. And we had really wanted to develop a platform in our writing MOOC where we could evaluate the evaluator. And so to do that, we had to build our own peer review system. And we had quite a lot of appreciation from students in the fact that they could really understand and grow from their own writing based on being evaluated by their peers. And we had to develop a structure where they had to kind of describe and assess and suggest ways of improvement. So it wasn't just I liked it or I didn't like it, but we had strict explanations well ahead of time to help them.
Anybody have a question that's not about peer evaluation, just to give equal time? Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
Lee Willard from Duke. I just wondered what kinds of information you're collecting on the actual MOOC professors and how that changes them in attitude and engagement. Seems like that's part of the equation, and we're measuring half of the equation.
Anybody assessing the instructors in a data?
And their attitudinal changes or their engagement changes and how this impacts their other teaching of their other courses on campus.
That does happen at a local level at Princeton, I know that. And then at a more global level, one way to evaluate the quality of instructors is just to see the retention rates across different courses, although that's difficult because it's confounded with topic. But it's a great question. I don't think there's a systematic process in place.
We've had a little bit of discussion at Stanford about whether someone's, well, our model has been typically that we develop online material and then use it both in the class on campus and then, if the instructor wishes, a public MOOC. So there's been some discussion about whether teaching the MOOC or using the flipped class increases someone's teaching evaluations or decreasing it. And we have some good examples in which it seemed to improve a professor's teaching evaluations. And then, of course, as you'd expect, whenever it didn't, there was a good explanation associated with that. Another question? Yeah, whatever you want. Okay.
All right.
But, maybe you need the microphone. It's a little hard to hear.
Plagiarism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Judy Low from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So I'd like to know whether plagiarism concerns any of you when we use the peer assessment. Well, the reason why it came to me is that, well, we have a peer assessment on one of our courses, and some students are reporting that well, some other students are submitting with some model answers. And well, so because we really do have a model answers, which some students of our former on-campus course does have. But it then led me to think, well, consider about, well, when we do peer assessment, we let students look at other student submissions, and some of them are very great submissions and attempts. What if those students did record those answers and share amongst others? So, well, does it make well, all our efforts on designing the good rubrics and like well, some kind of waste?
We haven't found any examples of people, you know, taking work from other students, but we have a lot of examples of people who've just pretty much cut and pasted things from the World Wide Web. There's information out there on so many things now, and people have attempted to submit, and probably gotten away with it on occasion, but they've attempted to submit things that they've just copied verbatim without citing. And we have a plagiarism button, on the peer assessment page, and when that goes off, we check. Our TA looks into it, and those people don't get any credit for the assignment. I find just in general it's a problem with a lot of online learning now. When people can have time to search something up and post it in a discussion forum, it's a problem.
I would second that. With plagiarism, I think is a major challenge in peer assessment and in the kind of assessments I was promoting. It's very easy to plagiarize an answer in our assessments. And on one hand, I think the platform doesn't help us very much in finding it, so we do rely a lot on, say, the students in the peer assessment. But there's another challenge, which is educating the students on what plagiarism is. We've noticed in some of the Melbourne Uni courses that we actually need to add something into the course content that's, this is what is really against the rules just because of cultural differences. And that's like a globalization challenge, I suppose.
I'd like to just add that one way to ameliorate some of the problem is to design assessments where it's very unlikely for somebody to be able to find something that is copyable. So, for example, a project-based work where somebody's designing a training guide for a very specific population tasked with a very specific type of thing. It's going to be a little bit harder to just copy and paste that from Wikipedia. So that can help. It's not going to do away with it altogether. But we do not rely on our students at Johns Hopkins. In fact, we explicitly tell them not to grade down if they suspect plagiarism. And the reason we do that is that the student who's being accused of plagiarism has no means of appealing that. They don't have a way to go back and say, well, I understand why you think it was plagiarism, but it's not, and here's why. There's no way to judge that. So we say if you suspect plagiarism, ignore it in your grading. Go ahead and grade on the content, but then give them feedback in the qualitative area that you suspect it, here's why, and here's how to improve, because maybe the student doesn't even understand what plagiarism is. So it can be a teaching moment, but some people might be slipping through the net and earning credentials that they don't really deserve. So we just sort of take that as part of the lay of the land for the moment.
Yeah, we don't. There's just something, antithetical to giving people credit for something that they just cut and pasted from another source. And so when, the plagiarism button goes off, we check.
This may be too idealistic, but I just think the notion of plagiarism within Coursera runs so counter to the mission that I don't think it's worth our energy to think about. It's learning for the sake of learning. And especially in my course, there's no statement of accomplishment, there's no certificate. So it's amazing what these students are doing just to learn and to learn statistics. I'd rather focus my energy on, things like you're doing, designing really cool new assessments than worrying about that small percentage that's going to do that and really not reap any reward, I think, in the long run. But if they don't have the qualification, then they don't have the qualification.
Another question? We'll take one or two more, if there are. David in the front.
Hi, Michael Weinraub, New York City Department of Ed. A number of times today we've heard that the peer-to-peer assessments are quite similar to what the instructors believe they should be. So I won't talk about accuracy, I'll just talk about impact on students. Do any of you have thoughts, or have you studied the impact on students depending on who's giving the grade or who's giving the feedback? Even if the feedback's the same, I'm wondering if there's a difference on the student, either in terms of their later participation or engagement in the course, based on who it is that's actually giving them the feedback.
Anybody have a take on that?
It's a really good question, but we have not looked at that. I think somebody should.
It is interesting, but when you think of the platform that we're dealing with, I don't think people come into a MOOC and expect to be graded by the faculty. I think they expect to be graded by their peers if there's that kind of an assignment. So, but it's an interesting question, I agree.
Dave, anybody? One more question here since you had.
So I'm Dave Barker-Plummer from Stanford. This is more of a comment than a question, but I think the aforementioned Scott Clemmer, doesn't he give pre-graded assessments, pre-graded assignments as part of the things that other people are asked to assess, so that he can calibrate their assessments with this idealized pre-graded assessment?
All right, so we have a question for Scott Clemmer, who's not here, and I'll do, but I know the answer actually because I worked on this a little bit. So basically, the study that we carried out had to do with evaluating the accuracy and bias of graders, and the way we measured that was to insert into the set of assignments that were graded a number of sample solutions for which we had a prior understanding of what the appropriate grade might be. And so by comparing the grade that was given by the student in the class with what we understood to be the correct grade, we were able to calibrate them. And then by comparing someone's grade to a grade given by a grader who we had previously calibrated, we kind of by extension were able to do some calculations for each grader, and we're able to calculate in some way the accuracy, which would be a multiplicative factor. How much should you count that person's grade in giving a composite assessment, and a bias. Are people typically high and typically low? And then the grade that was assigned to each student in the MOOC was a weighted average of corrected grades, where the correction had to do with adding or subtracting this accuracy factor. And the evaluation in the end was by comparing a sample to hand-graded solutions, that they're extremely good and way better after that process than prior. And there's a couple of research papers describing that study. We're kind of coming to the end, so I'd like to offer each of the panelists 1 minute to make a final statement if you'd like, or we will like to say anything at the end?
I'll go last.
Okay.
I'll go less than 1 minute. I'm somewhat surprised at the emphasis on peer assessment and not just on assessment of student learning. So, just doing, like in my course, I do a statistics literacy pre-test and post-test, and thank God they got better. And I do an assessment of statistics anxiety, it goes down. I do an assessment of statistics attitude, it gets better. So I'm curious now, I want to do some research and see what the percentage is of peer assessment versus just automated grading, because I'm surprised that we were so focused here on peer assessment. It's fine. It's just I don't do that. So.
Yeah, I think people are struggling to make their assessments authentic learning experiences, and I think having people write essays and have them graded are the way around it. I would like to see. I'm looking forward to the evolution of the MOOC platforms to, as I mentioned before, to see ways of incorporating authentic discussions and some of the community building that happens into the assessments as well.
I'll just give a plug for Carlton that I'm really intrigued by LTI and interested in learning more about how we can incorporate into what we're doing at Johns Hopkins, because I can definitely see some opportunities.
So I come from a computer science background, if you haven't already guessed. And so for me, I think there is some intrinsic value in peer assessment, which comes from grading fellow students. But I think a lot of the time it gets used as a crutch because we don't have computer algorithms or technology that can do the kind of assessment we want to do. And so I would just encourage everyone to reach out to computer scientists at your university, because they might get really excited about the opportunity to work on a MOOC or to integrate some of their kind of interesting capabilities into your MOOCs. And it could be a way that you could encourage research, both in computer science, and have an incredible learning experience at the same time.
Great. I'd like to close with a panel assessment. I'm going to give you 4 options, and I'd like you to vote for the one that you think was most important or valuable or enjoyable to you. The 4 options are the initial panelist presentations, the 5 minutes you had to discuss with your neighbors, the Q&A section, or the closing remarks. So how many people thought that the opening statements were valuable and would like to vote for them?
Multiple or single.
Oh, you want two okay, you can have 2 votes? Is that better? Okay, 2 things. You can vote for 2 things. Then you make the panelists feel better. Okay, so how many people vote for the panelist presentations? Everybody with 2 votes, votes one of them for there. How many people like the discussion portion in which you talk with somebody sitting next to you? Thought that was important? Small number, but everybody was noisy during the time. How many people like the Q&A? You were talking, yeah, right? How many people like the Q&A portion? How many people thought the closing statement was the most important? That's a joke, okay. And how many people would like us to do the Twitter thing again? How many people vote for that as a good idea? So-so is what I look like, 50-50. All right, thank you very much. I think we've all assessed everything in sight, so.